What if the one mistake you tried to forget came back to face you in front of an entire town? The high plains of Wyoming were a hard place, a land that showed no mercy to the weak. Near the Wind River Range, where the skies stretched too wide and too empty, Jesse Cole rode the trails like a man who belonged to no one. He worked cattle drives when the season called for it, fixed fences when ranchers needed help, and slept under the open sky because he believed he didn't deserve a roof or a home. He was quiet, distant, and strong in a way that felt carved out of old stone. Folks said he was a good man, but a man carrying a heavy load. No one knew the truth. Jesse preferred it that way. He didn't fear the war he survived. He feared the memories that followed him. There was a girl, young and soft-voiced, whose face returned to him only in the coldest hours before dawn. A night in Kansas. A room smelling of lilac water and stale whiskey. A ring in his hand. A vow he barely remembered making. Then he was gone at sunrise, riding south toward the cavalry and a war he wasn't sure he'd survive. He had married her. He was almost sure, yet he told himself it was a dream, a drunk man's mistake, something the war must have erased. For 9 long years he convinced himself she was better off forgetting him. But the guilt never left. It settled deep in him. Every time he fixed a fence, every time he lay under the stars, every time he stared into a whiskey glass, that shadow of a promise pulled at him. Haven Creek was the closest thing he had to a home, not because he lived there, but because he worked there. The people knew him well enough to trust him, but not well enough to ask questions. He liked it that way. He wasn't a man built for comfort. A month earlier, a dust storm had torn through the town, ripping the church steeple clean off and turning the general store into a pile of broken boards. Jesse came in just after the wind died. He saw the wreckage, the fear on people's faces, and the quiet determination they carried. Something inside him twisted, something bitter and old, and he stayed. He helped rebuild without asking for $1. He hauled timber, hammered nails, and worked until his hands split open. It felt like penance. It was late afternoon when the stagecoach finally came through the valley again, rolling slow through the mud-chewed street. Folks stopped what they were doing. The stage meant supplies, news, hope. Jesse was stacking flour sacks on the porch of the rebuilt mercantile. Sweat stained his shirt. Dust clung to his hair. He paused only when the driver hauled the coach door open and the passengers stepped out. A traveling salesman, a rancher Jesse recognized from up north, and then a woman. She stepped carefully onto the ground, her gloved hand gripping the doorframe like she needed it just to stay upright. Her pale green dress was worn thin from travel, her bonnet crooked, and her face was weary, truly weary, as if the road had taken more from her than miles. But she stood straight. There was steel beneath the exhaustion. Her eyes swept the broken town, then locked on Jesse. The look wasn't curiosity. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. Deep, aching recognition. Jesse froze. The sack of flour slipped from his fingers and hit the wooden porch with a dull thud. She walked toward him, 10 feet, 8, 6. The whole town sensed something was wrong. Boots stilled. Conversation stopped. Even the wind seemed to pause. She stopped right in front of him. Her voice came out soft, roughened by dust and days of travel. Jesse! His blood turned to ice. He didn't know her. At least he told himself he didn't. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you must be mistaken." She didn't look away, didn't blink. "No," she said, her voice steady even through the exhaustion. "There is no mistake." She reached into the worn reticule hanging from her wrist. Her fingers were shaking, not from fear, he realized, but from sheer tiredness. She pulled out a folded, yellowed paper. She opened it slowly, each crease worn thin from years of being handled. She held it out for him. "This is our marriage certificate," she said quietly. "Jesse T. Cole and Clara J. Byrne. Lawrence, Kansas. May 4th. 9 years ago. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jesse didn't take the paper. He could see enough from where he stood. The neat script, the date, the names. His name, unmistakable even in the blurred ink. That ain't proof, he said, anger rising to cover the fear smashing into him. Paper can be faked. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't argue. She didn't need to. Instead, she slowly pulled off her glove. On her third finger was a thin gold ring. Nothing fancy, nothing special, just a simple band. Jesse's lungs stopped working because under his own shirt, hidden on a leather cord he had worn for 9 long years, was its twin. He couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't move. The past he had buried so deep, it felt like another lifetime was standing right in front of him, in the dust and sunlight of Haven Creek. Clara swallowed. Her eyes softened, not with love, not with anger, but with something older and heavier. "Jesse," she whispered, "I'm your wife." The world crashed around him. He turned away, couldn't bear the eyes on him, couldn't bear hers, and pushed through the crowd. He mounted his horse and rode out of town without a word, the thunder of hooves echoing off the broken buildings. Behind him, Clara's voice broke the silence. "Jesse, please!" But he didn't stop. He rode until the sun died and the cold wind swallowed him whole. What hurts more, the truth someone tells you or the truth you've been running from your whole life? Jesse Cole rode into the night like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The whiskey he drank didn't numb him. The cold wind didn't clear his mind. Every mile he put behind him only made one thing clearer. He wasn't alone anymore. Not in the way that mattered. Not in the way that terrified him. Morning brought no comfort. He rode back to Haven Creek with his throat dry and his heart heavy. The town was already awake, tools clanking, and voices rising as they worked to rebuild after the storm. But the moment Jesse rode in, the sounds dimmed. Eyes followed him. Whispers spread like dust on the wind. And then he saw her. Clara sat on the porch of the Mercantile. She hadn't left the spot where he abandoned her yesterday. Her bag rested at her feet. Her shoulders were stiff, her eyes distant. She looked like a woman bracing herself against another storm. Jesse stepped toward her. The guilt was suffocating. "Ma'am," he began. She didn't look at him. He swallowed hard. "You can't stay out here. Storm's coming again." Her voice was flat, empty. "I didn't travel 2 months to sleep in the dirt." Jesse's shame almost knocked him backward. All he had was a stall at the livery, a place meant for horses, not a woman he'd once stood before God with. "It's the only dry place I got," he said quietly. Clara rose slowly. She was small, but she carried herself with a strength that cut deeper than any anger. "I didn't come for pity," she said. "I came for the truth." He had no answer. The storm hit fast, sharp rain, cold wind. And Jesse grabbed her arm, leading her toward the livery. She stumbled beside him, both of them soaked by the time they reached the barn. Inside, the air was thick with hay and old leather. The storm howled outside, beating against the roof. "You don't remember," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Do you?" Jesse leaned against a support beam, his head down. "Not all of it." Clara stepped closer. "I was 17. She said. "You were drunk. But you weren't cruel. You were scared. You told me I had kind eyes. You told me you didn't think you'd make it home." Jesse closed his eyes. Fragments of memory clawed at him. A soft voice. A cheap suit. A kiss that didn't feel like goodbye but turned into one anyway. "You promised to come back," she whispered. "You swore it." The guilt turned his stomach. "I was a coward," he said, his voice low. "I didn't think I deserved." "You deserted me," she said sharply, her voice cracking. "Maybe not the army, but you deserted me." And then the real blow fell. "I had a son." The world stopped. Her voice trembled. His name was Thomas. Jesse's knees almost buckled. A child. His child. Clara wiped her face with shaking fingers. "He had your eyes. He got sick." The winter was too cold. "I tried, Jesse. I tried everything." She broke. Completely. Jesse fell into the stall, his hands covering his face. The pain in his chest felt like a knife twisting deeper with every word she spoke. A son he never held. A baby he didn't know existed. A grave he never stood over. The storm outside grew worse, but nothing matched the storm inside them. "You take the loft," he finally said, his voice hollow. "It's dry." He didn't look at her, couldn't. He climbed into the empty stall and sat in the dark while she climbed the ladder to the loft. Her quiet movements above him felt like the weight of a past he could never escape. Morning didn't soften anything. Clara worked alongside the townspeople, trying to help even as they whispered behind her back. They called her a liar, a grifter, a woman trying to claim a man with nothing. Jesse heard it all, and he swallowed every word like poison. Until one night, the poison boiled over. Hank, a drunk teamster, saw Clara walking past the saloon. He laughed loud, loud enough for Jesse to hear. "There she goes," Hank jeered, "Cole's Kansas harlot." The saloon went silent. Jesse stood slowly, put down his whiskey, walked across the room with a calm that frightened the men watching him. "That's enough," he said. Hank smirked. "You going to deny it? You gonna say she didn't spend the night with you?" Jesse didn't think. He moved. He grabbed Hank by the shirt and slammed him against the wall so hard the bottles rattled. His forearm pressed against Hank's throat. "You will not speak her name." Hank choked. His face turned red. "Jesse," Silas warned, "let him go." Jesse's jaw tightened. The violence in him felt like fire under his skin. He could have killed Hank, right there, for her. He released him at the last second, letting the man collapse to the floor. When Jesse stepped out into the night, his hands were still shaking. Not from the fight, from the truth. He wasn't angry at Hank. He was angry at himself. Later that night, he found Clara quietly brushing down his horse in the livery. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing." He lied. She watched him. She always saw through him. "You shouldn't fight over me," she whispered. "You think I'll let them talk about you like that?" He snapped. Then his voice softened. "After what I did to you? What I cost you?" Her eyes filled with something he didn't expect. Hurt. "Jesse, fighting him doesn't change anything." She turned away, her shoulders trembling, but something had changed. After that night, Jesse didn't leave her side when she walked through town. He didn't touch her, didn't speak much. But he made sure every man who looked at her knew she was not alone. He didn't understand it fully yet, but she was becoming something to him again. Something dangerous. Something he didn't deserve. What would you do if the person you loved walked away because he thought you deserved a better life, only for danger to come for you the moment he let go? The morning the stagecoach returned for Clara, Jesse stood on the porch of the Mercantile like a man carved from stone. His face showed nothing, but inside he was breaking piece by piece. Elias Morrow stepped off the coach in his fine black suit and polished boots, looking like he belonged in a bank office back east. His smile was smooth, practiced, the smile of a man who believed he owned everything he touched. Clara looked small beside him, tired, uncertain. But when her eyes searched for Jesse, just one sign he wanted her to stay, she found nothing but silence. Jesse convinced himself this was mercy. He convinced himself she would be safer far away from him. He convinced himself she needed a life he could never give. So he said nothing, and that silence shattered her. She boarded the coach with trembling hands, her heart in pieces. Morrow lifted her valise with a satisfied tilt of his head. The door closed. The coach rattled forward. Clara pressed her hand to the window, her eyes begging Jesse for one last sign. He didn't move. He watched her disappear down the trail, swallowed by dust and distance. He had done the right thing. That's what he told himself. But every breath after that felt like punishment. For weeks he lived like a ghost. He slept in the small cabin he'd built for her, because the livery reminded him too much of her voice, her presence, her sobs in the storm. Every corner of Haven Creek whispered her name. Her garden patch wilted in the frost. Her kindness lingered in the town children she had smiled at. But she was gone, and Jesse had no one to blame but himself. Until one night, a freighter stumbled into the saloon, shaking snow from his coat, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't take the South Pass Trail," the man said. "It's a graveyard out there. Found a stagecoach turned over, driver dead. A fancy-looking man with a cane dead, too. Arrow in his back. Bandits, sure as sin." The saloon froze. Jesse's world stopped. "When?" Jesse rasped. The freighter shrugged. 4 days ago. Jesse didn't wait to hear more. His chair crashed back. He sprinted for the door, grabbed his horse, and rode into a freezing storm that swallowed the world whole. He rode like a man chasing the last chance he ever had. The storm was a living thing. Screaming sleet, freezing rain, wind sharp enough to cut skin. But Jesse forced his horse forward. He crossed rivers swollen with floodwater, broke ice on the banks with his boots, and rode through darkness so thick it felt alive. He rode until lightning lit the twisted wreck of the coach in a gully beside the raging Sweetwater River. The driver lay face down in the mud. Elias Morrow was sprawled nearby, his fine suit mud-soaked, an arrow in his back. Jesse didn't look twice. He searched for her. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice breaking. A faint sound, so small he almost thought he imagined it, rose from beneath the overturned coach. He dropped to his knees. Her hand was sticking out from under the wreckage. "Jesse!" she breathed, barely conscious. He shoved his shoulder under the broken wooden frame. Pain shot white-hot down his side, tearing open his old war scar. But he pushed anyway. He pushed until his vision went black. "Crawl!" he yelled. "Go!" She dragged herself free just as the coach slammed back into the mud. Jesse collapsed beside her. Two broken people in a broken storm. They crawled, half carried, half dragged themselves, to a shallow cave above the floodline. Jesse built a fire with one shaking hand. He wrapped her in blankets. He bound her broken arm. She tied his sling, her fingers trembling as she touched the torn flesh of his shoulder. They huddled in the flickering light, soaked, freezing, alive. She woke once, crying out, "Jesse, don't leave me again, please." He pulled her into his arms, his voice breaking. "I won't. Not this time. I'm here. I'm not leaving you, Clara." When the storm passed, they walked home. It took days. Clara rode when she couldn't walk. Jesse limped beside her in the mud, half dead but refusing to stop. By the time Haven Creek saw them, they were almost unrecognizable. Torn clothes, bruised faces, blood and mud covering them both. But they were alive, and they were together. The town that once judged them now fell silent with shame. Mrs. Miller ran to help. Silas shouted for blankets. Even Mrs. Davies, the preacher's wife, covered her mouth in horror at what she saw. The truth was plain. This was no scandal. This was survival. And devotion. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Jesse healed in the small cabin he'd built. The town brought soup, bandages, firewood. And for the first time in a long time, Haven Creek noticed something deeper, something stronger, blooming between the couple who had suffered more than most. Then Preacher Davies came, hat in hand, and cleared his throat. "I owe you both an apology," he said stiffly. "Your marriage certificate is valid. And after what you endured, God himself has made his judgment. I think it is time this town made its own." And so, on a cold Sunday morning, with the church half rebuilt, Jesse and Clara stood before the preacher. Their clothes were simple. Their faces still bore healing bruises. But they held hands. Their vows weren't new. They were finally honored. "What God has joined together," the preacher said, "let no man put asunder." Jesse looked down at Clara, and she smiled through tears. They moved into the little cabin, not as strangers, not as broken people held together by guilt, but as partners. They planted a real garden in the spring. They raised a colt in the summer. Clara taught the town's children in the church, and Jesse built fences and tended fields. Their grief didn't vanish. but they carried it together. Some nights, Clara woke crying for the baby she lost. Jesse held her through every tear. Some nights, Jesse woke from nightmares of the war. Clara took his hand and whispered that he wasn't alone anymore. And slowly, carefully, the pieces of their lives began to fit together. One quiet winter evening, as snow fell soft and silent outside their window, Clara leaned into Jesse's side on their small porch, her breath warm in the cold air. "What now?" she whispered. Jesse wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Now," he said softly, "we live." And this time, he meant it.